He knew from the very first day. He knew who had sent her, who she reported to at the end of every week, and what they were hoping to extract from the access they had so carefully engineered. He let her walk through his door anyway, installed her in the corner office with the best view in the building, and said absolutely nothing about any of it. For 6 weeks, Elena Vasquez believed she was the most dangerous person in that building. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about almost everything, as it turned out. But the one thing she eventually got right was the one thing nobody on either side had planned for. And by the time she understood it clearly enough to name it, the war had already started, and she had already chosen a side that had nothing to do with the people who had sent her there. Elena Vasquez was 28 years old, stood 5'5", and wore a size 18, and she had spent the better part of a decade learning to move through the world as efficiently and as invisibly as possible, folding herself into the minimum necessary footprint in any room she occupied. Because she had learned from long experience that taking up space invited comment, and comment was the particular brand of cruelty she was least equipped to absorb without damage. She had a round, expressive face that showed everything she was thinking before she had a chance to decide whether to share it. Warm brown eyes that her mother called her best feature and that she had spent years hiding behind her hair, and a memory so precise it bordered on unsettling. The kind of memory that let her reproduce a conversation verbatim 6 hours after having it, reconstruct the layout of a room she had walked through once, identify a number she had glimpsed on a screen from across an office, and recall it perfectly 3 days later without having written it down. It was the memory that had gotten her into this mess. Elena had been working as a senior office administrator for a mid-size import firm in Brooklyn when Viktor Sokolov's men had first made contact, 2 months after her younger brother Marco had borrowed $60,000 from an associate of Viktor's to cover a gambling debt, and then spectacularly failed to repay it on the agreed schedule. She had not known about the debt until the night 2 very large men had appeared at the door of her apartment in Bushwick with a proposition she was not in any practical position to refuse. The Sokolov faction needed someone with no criminal record, no known associations, and an exceptional memory to place inside the legitimate business operation of the Greco organization, specifically inside Greco Holdings, the event planning and commercial real estate management company that Carmine Greco used as the primary legitimate face of his family's enterprise. They had a position arranged, a genuine opening for an executive administrator that Greco Holdings had recently posted, and all Elena needed to do was apply, get hired, and spend the next several months remembering everything she saw and heard while appearing to be nothing more than a competent, unremarkable office administrator who happened to wear a size 18 and keep her eyes down. In exchange, Marco's debt would be erased. In exchange, Marco would keep his knees. Elena was not a criminal. She had never wanted to be. She was a woman who paid her taxes, sent money home to her mother every month, kept her head down, and had spent her entire adult life trying to outrun the particular, grinding cruelty of a world that decided how much she was worth the moment it processed her size. She had no leverage and no alternatives she was willing to live with, and so she had agreed, and she had applied for the position at Greco Holdings, and she had been called in for an interview 3 days later, which she had prepared for with the meticulous, driven precision she brought to everything she did when she was frightened, and she had been offered the role within 48 hours of leaving the building. She had been so relieved to have made it through the hiring process, so exhausted by the terror of the past 3 weeks, that she had not stopped to ask herself a question that might have saved her considerable confusion over the weeks that followed, which was why the most carefully guarded private organization in New York had hired a complete stranger to an administrative position in its executive suite within 2 days of meeting her, without requesting a single additional reference, and why. The man who ran it had shaken her hand at the end of the offer call with the particular, unhurried quality of a person who had already decided everything important before the conversation began. Carmine Greco was 36 years old, and he had been running the Greco organization with the same precise, undemonstrative authority since the age of 31, inheriting a family enterprise that spanned commercial real estate, private event management, and a network of less visible operations across 3 boroughs of New York that the organization's enemies had been trying, without notable success, to disrupt for nearly a decade. He did not look like anyone's idea of a crime boss, which was, as he had understood from a very young age, one of his primary advantages. He was lean and dark-eyed, with a controlled stillness about him that read, to people who did not know him, as the composed authority of a man who had simply been raised to occupy boardrooms. Those who did know him understood the stillness differently, as the absolute, economy of motion quality of a man who had trained himself never to spend a gesture or a word that was not entirely intentional. He dressed quietly, in dark, well-made clothes that cost more than they appeared to, and he had built his entire empire on the bedrock principle that the most dangerous power was the kind nobody was looking at. His legitimate operation, Greco Holdings, was real and profitable and operated by genuine professionals, many of whom had no idea that the company they worked for was a meticulously maintained front for an organization that had controlled significant portions of New York's port logistics and private financing infrastructure for 2 generations. He employed 1,200 people across 7 properties and had won 2 industry awards in 3 years, a fact that he found privately amusing. Nico Barros, his underboss and the only person inside the organization who understood the full shape of Carmine's intelligence operations, had brought him the dossier on Elena Vasquez 4 days before she had applied for the position. Nico was 42, built like a door that had learned to walk, and had a gift for sitting in rooms in ways that made people forget he was in them, a skill Carmine had valued more than any weapon his organization possessed. Nico had intercepted the communication between the Sokolov faction and a contact at a Brooklyn employment agency through a surveillance asset he had cultivated for over a year, and the details of what the Sokolov faction intended, specifically the placement of a memory-gifted civilian inside Greco Holdings' executive suite, had arrived on Carmine's desk with a week to spare. He had read the dossier twice. He had looked at the photograph, a candid shot of Elena outside the import firm in Brooklyn where she currently worked, wearing a coat that was too big for her and carrying a bag that was too heavy and moving with the particular, shoulders-in posture of someone who had been apologizing for her own existence for a long time. He had then done something that surprised even Nico, who had known him for 11 years. He had authorized the hire. "She's their asset," Nico had said, very carefully. "She's their asset," Carmine had agreed, setting the dossier aside. "She's also the clearest window into the Sokolov operation we're likely to get without spending 3 months and considerable resources trying to cultivate one ourselves." Nico had processed that for a moment. "You're going to feed her. I'm going to give her enough access to keep them satisfied," Carmine said, "and enough misdirection to keep them moving in the wrong direction while I figure out what they're actually planning." He had paused, looking at something on his desk rather than at Nico. "The brother's debt is $60,000 to a Sokolov associate. She has no viable alternative. She's not in this by choice. That doesn't make her not dangerous," Nico said. "No," Carmine agreed. "It makes her a woman in an impossible situation who is going to do what she has to in order to protect her family, which is a motivation I understand considerably better than ideology or greed." What Carmine had not told Nico, because he was not yet certain how to explain it to himself, was that he had also spent an unusual amount of time looking at the photograph, at the expression on Elena's face in the moment before she had noticed the camera, which was the look of a woman carrying something very heavy and doing it entirely alone, and that something about that expression had lodged in the back of his mind in a way that the dossier's other details, the memory capability, the brother's debt, the Sokolov connection, had not. He had not examined that particular response closely yet. He would, eventually. The building had time. On the morning Elena Vasquez arrived for her first day, Carmine was already at his desk at 7:45, which was his standard hour, and Nico was in the doorway with coffee and the weekly security briefing, and neither of them mentioned anything about the woman who was currently signing into the front desk visitor log downstairs and believing, with the sincere and understandable conviction of someone who had prepared very carefully for a deception, that the most dangerous part of today was already behind her. The executive floor of Greco Holdings occupied the upper third of a glass tower on Varick Street, and it had the particular quality of extremely well-managed wealth, the kind that expressed itself not through ostentation but through the precise, uninterrupted quality of every surface, every material, every sight line, all of it calibrated to communicate control without broadcasting it. Elena walked out of the elevator on the 14th floor on a Monday morning in February wearing her best blazer, the dark navy one she had owned for 3 years and reserved for interviews, and found a floor that was already operating at full velocity, 7 assistants at glass-partitioned desks, the low murmur of a conference call bleeding through a closed door, and a woman named Christina Voss materializing from behind a reception partition with the particular, assessing efficiency of someone who had decided her opinion of the new hire before the elevator doors had finished opening. Christina was the director of executive operations, 41, with the kind of sharp-featured elegance that came from spending significant resources on appearing effortless, and she looked at Elena with the brief, clinical scan of a woman cataloging a problem. "Miss Vasquez," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of a well-maintained professional relationship with a subordinate she had not chosen. "We've set you up at the desk outside Mr. Greco's suite. You'll be handling his primary calendar, external correspondence, and any meeting preparation he delegates through me. Mr. Greco's time is the most protected resource in this building. I'll need you to understand that immediately." "I understand," Elena said, because she did, and because nothing in Christina's manner invited a longer response. She was shown to her desk, a beautifully maintained workspace outside a set of heavy glass doors etched with the Greco Holdings logo, and she was given 3 ring binders of procedural information, a login for the calendar management system, and a brief, efficient orientation from a junior assistant named Priya, who seemed to like her immediately in the instinctive, wordless way that some people liked you before you had given them any particular reason to. Elena spent the first hour memorizing everything, which was what she always did in new environments, cataloging the layout of the floor, the rhythms of the people who moved through it, the timing of Christina's passes through the space, the cadence of activity around the conference room at the far end. She also spent the first hour cataloging what she was authorized to report to Victor's contact and what she would need more time to access, a mental list that sat in a second, quieter layer of her consciousness underneath the genuine professional attention she was giving to the job itself, because she had always been capable of running 2 parallel tracks of thought simultaneously, and today both tracks were working hard. Carmine Greco emerged from his office at 9:45, and the floor's energy shifted almost imperceptibly the moment the glass doors opened, not with fear exactly, more with the particular, instinctive attention that high-functioning people give to the presence of someone whose judgment they respect enough to find consequential. He was taller than the dossier photograph had suggested, broad-shouldered, unhurried, with the kind of composure that read as entirely natural until you looked at his eyes and realized it was entirely controlled. He stopped at Elena's desk. She stood, because Priya had told her he preferred that, and she had filed that detail away immediately. He looked at her, and Elena had the sudden, disorienting experience of being looked at by someone whose attention had a different quality than most people's, not the skimming, categorizing attention she was accustomed to from new authority figures, but something more particular, more focused, as though he were looking for something specific rather than building a general impression. "Miss Vasquez," he said. "Welcome to the 14th floor." "Thank you, Mr. Greco," she said. "I appreciate the opportunity." He studied her for a moment that lasted exactly 1 second longer than a welcoming glance required, and something in his expression, the specific quality of his stillness, triggered a cold thread of instinct in Elena's chest that she could not immediately explain and filed away for later examination. He was not suspicious of her. He was not wary. He was neither of those things. What he was, though she did not have the right word for it yet, was already aware, the particular quality of a man who knows the shape of a room before he walks into it, and she had the unnerving, irrational feeling that the room in question was specifically her. "Christina will walk you through the afternoon schedule," Carmine said, his voice giving nothing away. "If you have questions my office can't resolve, come directly to me." He walked away before she could respond, which she later understood was intentional, and Elena stood at her desk in her best navy blazer and told herself the feeling in her chest was nerves and not the first premonition of something considerably more complicated. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm she had not expected, which was the rhythm of an ordinary, well-run office, punctuated by the ongoing, low-grade wrongness of a job that required her to perform 2 separate roles simultaneously while hoping neither audience noticed the performance. Elena was good at her actual work. She was meticulous and fast, and had a gift for anticipating what a calendar demanded before it was asked of her. And by the end of the first week, Three of the junior assistants had already started directing questions to her that technically should have gone to Christina, a fact that Christina noticed without commenting on, and that Elena filed away as a variable to manage carefully. She reported to Victor's contact every Friday evening, a woman named Irina who communicated through a series of encrypted messages and who received Elena's account of the week's events with the cool, evaluative patience of someone who understood that intelligence was slow work and did not expect a windfall in the first month. What Elena reported was real but limited: the broad shape of Greco Holdings' legitimate operations, the rhythm of Carmine's meeting schedule, the names of clients she encountered during meeting preparation, the general character of the organization's activity. She had not yet accessed anything that the Sokolov faction would consider genuinely valuable, partly because the access she needed was not something she could rush without drawing attention, and partly because something about the way information moved on the 14th floor made her instincts, always sharp and always restless, continuously uneasy. The access she was given was generous. Too generous, she began to think, by the end of the second week. Her role should have involved standard executive administration, calendar management, and correspondence handling, the kind of work that sat at the organized periphery of decision-making without actually touching it. Instead, she found herself pulled into meeting preparation at a level she had not expected, given briefing documents to organize that contained genuine strategic details about Greco Holdings' property acquisition pipeline, asked to sit in on client calls to take minutes at a level of specificity that gave her a closer window into the organization's financial structure than most external observers would ever see. She thought about why this was being allowed. She thought about it a great deal. She did not arrive at a satisfying answer. She also noticed that Carmine stopped by her desk most mornings, briefly, with a question about his schedule or a document to forward, and that these stops were always brief and always conducted with the same composed, specific attention he had given her on the first day, an attention that was not the entitled proximity of a powerful man enjoying a subordinate's discomfort, but something altogether different. The attention of a man who was paying very careful notice to something he had decided, for reasons he had not disclosed, to keep very close. She mentioned none of this to Irina. She filed it, instead, in the part of her memory reserved for things she did not yet know how to interpret. The misdirection she was being given was elegant. She would not understand until much later precisely how elegant. What Carmine was feeding her, through the carefully curated documents and strategically composed meeting materials she was being asked to organize, was a detailed and internally consistent picture of a property acquisition deal that did not exist. The deal appeared genuine, was supported by what looked like real financing documentation, legal correspondence, and title records, and pointed toward a conclusion that would, if acted upon by the Sokolov faction, direct significant resources toward a competitor of the Greco organization rather than toward Carmine himself. Nico had spent 3 weeks building the paper trail, and it was, in his own assessment, some of his finest work. Carmine had reviewed it twice and adjusted 2 details he found insufficiently convincing, and the resulting document package was so internally coherent that Elena, working through the materials with her extraordinary retention, had absorbed it almost perfectly and delivered a version of it to Irina that had generated what Irina described, in her next communication, as exactly the kind of actionable intelligence they had been hoping for. Elena had read that message sitting on her fire escape in Bushwick at 11 in the evening, wrapped in a coat against the cold, and instead of feeling the relief she had expected at having done something useful for Victor's contact, she had felt a distinct and inexplicable hollowness that she did not examine carefully enough to understand yet, and that had been growing, quietly, and without her fully permitting it, since the first time Carmine Greco had stopped at her desk and looked at her as though he had already decided something that she was still in the process of figuring out. The private exchange happened on a Thursday evening in the 5th week, when Elena stayed late to finish a meeting summary and found, at 7:30, that she was the last person on the floor except for Carmine, whose office light was visible through the frosted glass panels as a warm, unwavering amber rectangle. She gathered her things as quietly as possible, intending to leave without disturbing him, and was halfway to the elevator when the glass doors opened and he stepped out, jacket still on, tie loosened a single fraction, carrying a document folder that he set on her desk with the easy precision of a man who never misplaced anything. You don't need to stay this late, he said. The summary can wait until morning. I prefer to finish what I start, Elena said, which was true and had nothing to do with her secondary agenda, which required her to be in the building during off hours to access certain shared directories that were less monitored after 6. Carmine studied her for a moment with the same specific, unhurried quality she had learned over 5 weeks to brace herself for slightly, because it consistently made her feel transparent in a way she could not afford to be and did not entirely understand. Sit down, he said, and gestured to the chair across from her own desk, which was an odd thing to do, to invite someone to sit at their own workspace. She sat, because not sitting felt more suspicious than sitting, and he leaned against the partition with his arms crossed and looked at her the way he had been looking at her for 5 weeks, except this time without the buffer of the workday and a floor full of people between them. You're very good at this job, he said. Thank you, Elena said carefully. I mean it precisely, he said, not as a pleasantry. You organize information the way people who think in systems do, not the way people who were trained to do it do. The distinction is visible in the output. Elena did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, which he appeared to read as an invitation to continue. I'd like to know what you were doing before Greco Holdings, he said. The resume is clean but brief. Office administration, she said. Import firm in Brooklyn. Before that, administrative support at a law firm in Queens, both of which you left voluntarily, according to your references, he said. Both of which, according to your own account during the hiring interview, failed to offer you anything proportionate to your actual capability. She had said something like that. She remembered now. In the second interview, when a question about professional growth had drawn an answer more honest than she had intended, and she had wondered afterward whether it had been a mistake. I appreciate you saying so, she said, neutral and careful. I'm not saying it to be gracious, Carmine replied, the same way he said most things, with the flat, clean certainty of a man who had long since stopped performing for audiences. I'm saying it because I'm considering whether to expand your role, and I find that decisions of that kind are easier to make correctly when both parties understand each other plainly. The conversation extended another 20 minutes past that point, and when Elena finally left the building and walked toward the subway in the February dark, she spent the entire ride to Bushwick trying to identify what had just happened, because something had shifted in the architecture of the arrangement in a way she could not precisely articulate. He had asked her about herself. Not the professional resume version of herself, but the version underneath it, the capabilities she had never been given the right room for, the instincts she had spent years applying to tasks that did not deserve them. He had asked with the attention of a man who intended to use what he learned, and she could not tell whether that was a professional calculation or something else entirely. The wardrobe situation resolved itself in the 6th week, not as a gift and not as a directive, but in the form of a message from Nico that said only that the company had an account with a private tailor on West 22nd Street, and that as a member of the executive administrative team, she was entitled to use it for work-appropriate clothing. No further commentary provided. She went to the appointment out of pride more than anything else, expecting to be the awkward obligation in a fitting room designed for women half her size, and found instead a small, immaculate studio run by a woman named Ida, who looked at Elena's frame with the dispassionate, expert attention of a craftsperson assessing a material she enjoyed working with and produced, over the following 2 weeks, 3 pieces that fit Elena with a precision and an ease she had genuinely never experienced in clothing before, a structured black blazer that fit her shoulders rather than fighting them, dark tailored trousers that did not require a belt and a series of mental adjustments every time she stood up, and a deep burgundy wrap blouse that she put on for the first time in her apartment bathroom and stared at for an uncomfortable amount of time before admitting to herself that she looked like a woman who belonged in the rooms she had been walking into every day and not like a woman who was apologizing for being there. She wore the burgundy blouse to a client presentation in the 7th week, and the effect on the floor was small but measurable, a slight recalibration of the invisible social calculations that govern the executive level of any organization, the kind of shift that happened when someone who had been occupying a defined subordinate position began, without fanfare or announcement, to look like someone who belonged somewhere larger. Christina noticed it immediately, because Christina noticed everything immediately, and the form her noticing took was a Tuesday morning 2 days after the presentation, when she stopped at Elena's desk at 9 and delivered a set of meeting preparation instructions in a tone that was professionally appropriate in every individual component and collectively unmistakable in its intent. Mr. Greco has a Q3 strategy review with the London team this Friday, Christina said, setting a folder on Elena's desk with the particular, careful placement of a woman who did not want her fingerprints on anything too obvious. The preparation package is straightforward. Standard format. Nothing requiring your particular level of detail, I would think. I've asked Priya to handle it. Elena looked at the folder, then up at Christina. She had been handling all of Carmine's meeting preparation for 4 weeks, a function that had migrated to her desk entirely without Christina's visible objection until this moment. I usually handle his meeting prep, Elena said, keeping her voice even. You do? Christina agreed, pleasantly. Though for an international strategy review with this level of seniority, I think we want a more experienced hand on the materials. It's not a reflection on you. It's a calibration to the stakes. The 2 junior assistants within earshot had gone very still in the particular way of people who are pretending not to hear something while hearing every word. Elena understood, precisely and without room for misinterpretation, what was being communicated, that the burgundy blouse and the expanded role and the late evening conversation had been noticed, and that Christina was recalibrating the hierarchy back to the dimensions she was comfortable with, using the language of professional seniority to say something that had nothing to do with professional seniority at all. She had experienced this specific mechanism many times before, in many different rooms, each time dressed differently, sometimes as aesthetic judgment, sometimes as concerns about professionalism, sometimes, when people were being less careful, as an outright comment about whether she projected the right image for the client-facing role she had been given. It always meant the same thing. She was opening her mouth to give the gracious, absorbing answer she had learned to give in these situations, the one that accepted the reassignment without making anyone uncomfortable with the truth of why it was happening. When Carmine walked out of his office, he had clearly heard the tail end of the exchange. He did not look at Christina when he spoke, which was, Elena was learning, one of the signs that something he was saying was not for public performance, but simply for the record. Elena handles my meeting preparation, he said, his voice perfectly level and devoid of any edge that could be called a rebuke without his having to call it one. For everything on my calendar, including Friday's review, a silence fell over the section of floor within earshot, the particular, pressurized silence of people recalibrating a social understanding very quickly. Christina's expression did not change. She was too good at her job for that. Of course, she said, and picked up the folder and walked away. Carmine's eyes moved to Elena. She expected him to say something reassuring, some piece of professional validation that would smooth the moment into a category she could file and move past. He didn't. He simply looked at her for a moment with the same specific, unhurried attention that she had spent 7 weeks trying to read accurately, and then said, "Preparation notes for Friday are due by Wednesday. Let me know if you need access to the London team's prior quarter summary." He walked back into his office. The glass doors closed. Elena sat at her desk with the pulse in her throat hammering in a way that was not entirely attributable to the discomfort of the confrontation with Christina, and she understood, with a slow, distinctly unwelcome clarity, that whatever she had agreed to do for Viktor Sokolov's people was becoming increasingly difficult to square with the fact that she had started, sometime in the past 3 weeks, to genuinely care about the outcome of what happened in this building, and that caring about outcomes was a catastrophic development for a person in her particular situation. She sat with that discomfort through the afternoon and into the evening, working through the Friday preparation materials with her usual meticulous speed and precision, and she was 3 hours into it when she noticed, in the prior quarter's financial summary, she had been given access to a discrepancy so small it should not have registered, a series of vendor payments from the London subsidiary that rounded in a specific, repeating way she had seen before in a fraud detection case study she had read 3 years earlier while trying to teach herself the kind of accounting literacy that might have given her more options in the job market. She stared at it for a long time. Then she printed the relevant pages, folded them, and put them in her coat pocket. She did not yet know what she was going to do with them, but she understood, holding them in her hand, that she had stopped being purely a spy somewhere between the burgundy blouse and Carmine Greco telling a room full of people to adjust to her instead of the other way around, and that the person she was in the process of becoming was going to have to make a decision very soon about what she actually owed to either side of the arrangement she had been dropped into. The vendor payment discrepancy was not the first one. That was what she discovered over the next 3 evenings, sitting at her kitchen table in Bushwick with the legitimate access she had been given to the London subsidiary's quarterly records and the particular, relentless attention she brought to any numerical pattern that didn't resolve cleanly. The payments were small, and they were consistent, and they had a signature, a specific rounding pattern in the $100 range that appeared only in transactions processed on the last business day of each month, and they routed to a vendor listed in the system under a registration number that, when she cross-referenced it against the public corporate registry she could access through the library's database, did not correspond to any real commercial entity in the United Kingdom. Someone inside the organization was moving money out of the London subsidiary, small enough to avoid the standard audit thresholds, consistent enough to have accumulated, she estimated over the past 14 months, somewhere in the region of $400,000. She sat with that number for a long time. She thought about who had authorized the invoices, which required a level of access she did not have, and she thought about how to get it without revealing what she was looking at and to whom, and she thought, too, about the fact that she had a Friday deadline on the strategy review materials and that tucked inside those materials was the financial summary of the London subsidiary, which meant she had a legitimate reason to be looking at exactly the records she was looking at, and that whoever had been removing money from the subsidiary might very soon notice that the executive administrator upstairs was spending an unusual amount of time in the wrong part of the financial archive. She was not a spy anymore. She was not sure she had been for at least 2 weeks. She was a woman with a problem she needed to tell the right person about before the wrong people found out she had found it, and there was only one person in this situation who was both the right person and the person she was absolutely not supposed to trust. She walked into Carmine's office on the Thursday morning before the Friday review and closed the door behind her, which she had never done before, and set the printed pages on his desk and said, plainly and without preamble, "Someone in your London office has been stealing from you. I found it in the subsidiary financials while I was preparing the review materials. I don't know who authorized the invoices, but I can tell you the vendor is a ghost entity and the payments have been running for 14 months. Carmine looked at the pages for a long, unhurried moment. He did not look surprised, which she would have understood as composure in another context, but in this one felt different. He looked, instead, like a man receiving a piece of information he had been waiting for, specifically the information about what she would do when she found it. "Sit down," he said, and his voice carried something she had not heard in it before, a very small, very controlled quality of warmth that was entirely different from the professional composure he wore everywhere else. Elena sat. Carmine looked at her directly, and the particular, specific, focused quality of his attention in that moment was unlike any version of it she had experienced in the 9 weeks she had been on that floor, because this time it was not assessing, and it was not guarded, and it was not the patient, calculated attention of a man running an intelligence operation. It was the attention of a man looking at someone who had just answered the question he had actually been asking for 2 months. "You've been sending reports to Irina Volkov every Friday evening," he said. The floor dropped out from under Elena's stomach so completely she felt it physically, a cold, vertiginous drop that left her gripping the arms of the chair with both hands. She did not deny it. There was no version of denial available to her in that room, not with that man, not after the expression on his face in the previous 30 seconds. She said nothing, because nothing was the most honest response available to her. "I've known since before you applied," Carmine said. "Nico intercepted the communication from Sokolov's people 4 days before your application arrived." Elena closed her eyes for 3 seconds. "Open them." "You hired me anyway," she said. "Why?" "Because I needed a window into Sokolov's operation," he said. "And because I read your file. And because a woman who was coerced into a situation she had no good alternative to is not the same as a woman who chose it. I wanted to see what you would do when you found something real. Something that was actually mine to lose." He let that sit. Elena felt it land. The conversation that followed was the longest and most honest conversation Elena had ever had in a professional setting, or possibly in any setting. Because Carmine Greco, having confirmed that she knew he knew, proceeded to tell her everything: the misdirection operation, the fabricated property deal he had fed her, the 14 months of careful intelligence gathering the London payment discrepancy had just blown open, and his current best understanding of what Viktor Sokolov was actually planning, which was not, it turned out, simply a financial extraction from the London subsidiary. Viktor Sokolov wanted the Greco organization's port logistics contacts, specifically the network of relationships with customs and shipping infrastructure on the East Coast that the Greco family had built over 3 generations and that could not be replicated by any amount of money or aggression in any reasonable timeline. Stealing it required removing Carmine from the picture because the relationships were personal and would not transfer to a successor who had not built them. And the London subsidiary's ghost vendor payments were not an end in themselves, but a lever, a piece of documented financial irregularity designed to be fed, at the right moment, to a federal investigator on Sokolov's payroll, triggering a raid that would freeze Greco Holdings' operations and give Sokolov's people the window they needed to move on the port contacts directly. The person inside the organization who had been running the London payments was the subsidiary's financial director, a man named Hargreaves who had been on Sokolov's payroll for 18 months and who was currently sitting in London unaware that Elena Vasquez had just found his ghost vendor in a quarterly summary 3,000 miles away. Elena sat in Carmine's office and absorbed all of this with the same systematic, layered attention she had been giving to everything for 9 weeks, and when he finished she said, "They're going to move soon. Irina told me last week she was satisfied with the intelligence she had, which means they think the misdirection deal is real and they think the London irregularity is ready to use. They're not waiting for more from me." Carmine looked at her steadily. "That's what I thought," he said. "How much time do we have?" "Days," Elena said. "Maybe a week," he nodded, once, slowly. "Your brother's debt," he said. "It's already handled. Nico arranged it 4 days ago. Marco doesn't know where it came from." Elena stared at him. "You cleared it before you knew which way I'd go," she said. "I cleared it because a man's safety shouldn't depend on his sister being forced to do something she would otherwise never have chosen," Carmine replied, and said it the way he said everything that mattered, without inflection and without any visible requirement that she respond to it in a particular way, as though it were simply a fact about how the world should operate and he had applied it accordingly. Elena looked at him across his desk in the amber morning light of his office and felt the last remaining architecture of the arrangement. She had been dropped into collapse entirely, not violently but cleanly, the way a structure falls when the tension holding it in an unnatural shape is finally released. She was not a spy. She was not a pawn. She was a woman who had been put in an impossible position and had, without entirely planning to, chosen the right side, and the right side had, without requiring anything from her, cleared her debt and given her the best job she had ever had, and quietly arranged for her to stop being invisible in it. What was coming would be fast, and it would be dangerous, and it would require both of them to move precisely. And Elena, sitting across from the most controlled and unreadable man she had ever met, found that she was not afraid of any of that. She was, instead, something she had not felt in a very long time, which was entirely and specifically ready. "Tell me what you need from me," she said. Carmine looked at her for a moment, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen from him before, stripped of the careful composure and the patient calculation, something underneath all of it that was entirely unguarded and entirely real. "I need you to remember everything Irina has ever told you in exactly the order she told it," he said. "I need the full picture of what Sokolov believes he knows, in precise detail, so I can build what he's expecting to see." Elena nodded once. "Give me a pad and 2 hours," she said. She produced, over the next 97 minutes, a verbatim reconstruction of every communication she had received from Irina Volkov over the preceding 9 weeks, every instruction, every question, every evaluation of the intelligence she had provided, reproduced in order and in full with the specific, unhurried precision of a woman whose memory was not a trick or a gift, but simply the way her mind had always worked, the single capability she had spent her entire adult life either hiding or watching be used for purposes far smaller than it deserved. Carmine read through the pages twice, and when he set them down his expression was the closest thing to undisguised she had ever seen from him. "You've been carrying this for 9 weeks," he said. "Yes," Elena said. "Every word." He looked at her for a moment, and then he picked up his phone and called Nico and told him they were moving on Thursday, and that they had exactly what they needed to do it cleanly. Thursday arrived with the particular, pressurized stillness of a day that has been coming for a long time and has finally stopped waiting. Elena was at her desk at 7:45, in the black structured blazer from Ida's studio, with her memory freshly organized around everything Irina had told her and everything Carmine had told her and everything she had assembled herself over 9 weeks of running two parallel sets of attention through the same building. And she realized, the calmest she had been since the night two very large men had knocked on her apartment door in Bushwick and presented her with an arrangement. She had no good way to refuse. The plan was clean. Using the verbatim reconstruction Elena had produced of Irina's communications, Nico had spent the previous 48 hours building the exact picture the Sokolov faction was expecting to see, a final intelligence package that confirmed the fabricated property deal was approaching closing, that the London financial irregularity was about to be surfaced to the federal investigator, and that the Greco organization would be vulnerable to direct approach on the port contacts within the week. It was, in Nico's assessment, a perfect mirror of the operation Sokolov thought he was running, which meant that when Sokolov moved, he would move exactly where and when Carmine expected him to, against a set of positions the Greco organization had vacated and reinforced in advance. Elena's role in Thursday's operation was, on paper, to continue managing Carmine's schedule and to be available if Irina made contact. Her actual role, which she understood and had accepted without requiring it to be spelled out for her, was to sit at her desk outside his office and be the first early warning system if anything on the floor changed in a way that suggested the Sokolov faction had understood more than they were supposed to. She was good at this. She had been good at it for 9 weeks. What she had not planned for was Irina. At 10:47 in the morning, Elena's personal cell phone, which she kept in her desk drawer, buzzed with a message from a number she did not recognize, but that followed the specific formatting pattern Irina used for emergency contacts. The message was 3 words. "They know. Run." Elena stared at the message for approximately 4 seconds, then picked up her desk phone and called Nico's extension and said, "Sokolov knows we moved. Irina just warned me. Someone inside your setup told them." Nico's end of the line went very quiet, the specific quiet of a man who is simultaneously processing new information and redirecting resources without allowing the processing to slow the redirecting. "Don't move from that desk," Nico said. "Where is he?" Elena said. "Conference room 3, Nico said, and she was already out of her chair. She did not wait for permission. She did not run the calculation of whether walking into a conference room where Carmine was meeting with what she now understood were people the Sokolov faction had compromised was the sensible choice for a woman in her position. She walked down the floor with the specific, economical purpose she had brought to every crisis in every professional setting she had ever occupied, pushed open the door of conference room 3, and said, in a voice that was not loud but was entirely clear, "Mr. Greco, this meeting needs to end right now." 3 men at the conference table turned to look at her. Carmine's eyes found hers instantly, and she saw him read her expression in the single second available to him, which was all he needed, because he stood immediately, buttoning his jacket in one movement, and said to the room with the particular, absolute calm that preceded the most dangerous version of him, "Excuse me, gentlemen," and walked toward her. 2 of the men at the table stood as he moved, hands going to jackets, and Nico, who had come through the secondary door at the far end of the room in the same moment Elena had opened the main one, was faster than either of them. It was over in minutes rather than the cinematic extended violence of how these things sometimes appeared from the outside, fast and efficient and decisive in the way Carmine's organization apparently handled everything when it had time to prepare, which it did, because Elena had bought it 3 seconds and 3 seconds had been enough. When the room was quiet and the men who had been at the table were no longer able to present a problem, Carmine turned to where Elena was standing in the doorway and looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before in 10 weeks, completely and entirely undisguised. The look of a man who has just been reminded of something he already knew but had not felt until this specific moment. She had walked into a conference room full of armed men to warn him. She had not flinched, and she had not calculated, and she had not waited. She was still standing in the doorway in the black blazer, her breathing controlled and her hands steady, and he crossed the room and stopped in front of her and said, very quietly, "You were supposed to stay at your desk. You were supposed to not be in a room with 3 of Sokolov's people," she said. Viktor Sokolov's operation collapsed over the following 72 hours with the particular, comprehensive finality of a plan that has been outmaneuvered at every level by someone who had more time to prepare and more precise intelligence than the plan accounted for. Hargreaves was removed from the London subsidiary and replaced within 24 hours with the kind of efficiency that suggested Carmine had identified him as the leak 3 months earlier and had been waiting for the right moment to act, which Nico later confirmed without elaborating on how long the right moment had been building. The fabricated property deal, when Sokolov's people attempted to act on it, led them directly into a set of arrangements that had been constructed specifically to waste their time and resources on a transaction that would never close, and the federal investigator on Sokolov's payroll, faced with the London subsidiary's ghost vendor documentation being submitted to his superiors by an anonymous source that was not, as he had expected, himself, found himself explaining the irregularity from the wrong side of the desk rather than the right one. It was, in Nico's dry, understated summary, a complete outcome. Elena heard this version of events from Nico rather than from Carmine, because in the 48 hours after Thursday, she was given the option to take a fully paid week away from the office while the organization resolved its immediate priorities, an offer she accepted because she was tired in the deep, cellular way of someone who has been running 2 lives simultaneously for 10 weeks and has just been asked, finally, to stop. She spent 3 days sleeping and eating proper meals and sitting on her fire escape in the early March cold, not thinking about anything in particular, and on the 4th day Carmine called her. He did not open with anything about Thursday. He asked if she had eaten breakfast, which was so precisely unlike the way she had expected the conversation to begin that she laughed, which was the first time she had laughed fully and longer than she could immediately identify. He called again the next morning, and the morning after that, and when she came back to the office on Monday, the week felt different in the specific way that things feel different when the ground under them has shifted and everyone in the vicinity is quietly acknowledging it without making a formal announcement. Christina was civil in a way she had not been previously, which Elena read not as warmth, but as a recalibration that had apparently been administered without Christina's input during the week. Priya gave her a coffee and a look of pure, uncomplicated delight. Nico nodded at her in the elevator in the specific way he nodded when he had decided something permanent. 3 weeks after Thursday, Carmine asked her to come into his office after the floor had cleared for the evening, which she now recognized as his preference for conversations that were not for professional consumption. He told her that the consulting agreement he had been drafting with his attorney since February, the one that would formalize her expanded role in the organization's financial oversight, was ready for her review if she wanted to look at it. He also told her, in the same unhurried, factual tone he used when he was saying something he did not intend to dress up for the occasion, that he had known from the beginning that the operation would either confirm what he suspected about her or disprove it, and that it had confirmed it extensively, and that he intended to stop treating the confirmation as a professional conclusion and start treating it as what it actually was. She looked at him across his desk in the amber evening light of the office, this entirely singular, terrifying, meticulously controlled man who had let her into his building knowing exactly who had sent her and what she had been sent to do, and she understood that the thing he had been testing was never whether she would betray him. He had known, from reading her file, that the circumstances of her recruitment made betrayal the path of least resistance, and he had built his operation around the assumption that she would take it. What he had not known, and what had surprised him, and what the specific quality of his attention over 10 weeks had been tracking with the patient, absolute focus of someone watching for a particular answer to a question they had not asked aloud, was whether, given time and genuine proximity to something worth caring about, she would choose differently. She had. She had walked into a conference room with 3 armed men in it because the person on the other side of the door mattered more to her than her own calculation about personal risk, and that was the answer to the question he had actually been asking, and it was the only answer he had wanted. She did not say any of this. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "Send me the consulting agreement." I'll have notes by morning. And then, because she was finally, permanently, done making herself smaller for rooms that had not asked her to, she said, "And Carmine, next time you decide to run an intelligence operation with me as a variable, you could consider telling me what I actually walked into." His mouth curved, slightly, into the closest thing to a full smile she had seen from him yet. "You wouldn't have been as convincing if you'd known," he said. "I was convincing anyway," Elena replied. "Yes," he said. "You were." Was Elena right to trust a man who admitted he'd been watching her from the very beginning? Or do you think the smartest woman in that building was still the last one to understand what he actually wanted? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this dark, twisting story of a woman who was sent in as a weapon and became something the enemy never saw coming had you gripping the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Share it with a friend who loves a romance where neither person is exactly who they appear to be. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next time someone underestimates a woman who was always the most dangerous person in the room. Turn on notifications because the next story is coming and you will not want to be the last one to know.